The most expensive bank robbery in history didn't begin with guns, alarms, or masked men. It began with a printer that stopped printing. No explosions, no sirens, no late-night phone calls from security, just silence where noise was guaranteed. In a central bank, silence is never neutral. This machine was built to run non-stop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, printing every international transaction the moment it happened, turning invisible digital money into undeniable physical evidence. And on a quiet February morning in 2016, its paper tray was empty. No one panicked. Because machines fail. Because glitches happen. Because people trust systems they see every day. What no one realized, what no one could see, was that while the printer was silent, money was already moving. Hundreds of millions of dollars were being authorized, approved, and transferred across continents by computers that believed they were following legitimate orders. Somewhere servers were humming, confirmations were being logged, and a process designed to protect the global financial system was doing exactly what it was built to do. By the time anyone questioned the silence, the crime was already over. Nearly $1 billion had been set in motion without a single weapon, without a single threat, without anyone breaking into a building. This wasn't a failure of technology. It wasn't even a hack in the way most people understand hacking. This was something far more unsettling, a crime that worked because nothing appeared wrong. And by the time the printer came back to life, spitting out stacks of paper, no one remembered approving the system's most dangerous weakness had already been exposed, not in code, but in trust. Every large-scale crime depends on a moment so ordinary that no one remembers it, and in this case, that moment arrived quietly disguised as opportunity. Months before the money moved, before the printer fell silent, before anyone felt fear, an email landed in the inboxes of Bangladesh Bank employees, indistinguishable from hundreds of others they received every week. It wasn't threatening. It didn't rush. It didn't demand. It looked like a job application, polite, professional, almost forgettable. Inside it was a compressed file, a resume, a promise of future employment. When it was opened, nothing happened. No crash, no warning, no visible damage. That absence of drama was the point. What entered the system wasn't a blunt instrument, but a presence, custom-built malware designed not to steal, not to destroy, but to observe. It watched how people worked, how systems breathed, how trust flowed invisibly through routines repeated every day. It learned which logins mattered and which were ignored, which actions triggered oversight, and which passed silently because they always had. Like a patient predator, it didn't move until it understood the terrain. Over weeks and months, it mapped the bank's internal network, creating hidden pathways and encrypted backdoors, blending so completely into the background that it became indistinguishable from normal operations. This wasn't brute force hacking, it was social engineering at the level of institutions. The attackers didn't fight the system, they studied it, respected it, and then used its own logic against it. They discovered that security wasn't enforced by walls or locks, but by assumption, by repetition, by the belief that yesterday's normal would always be today's truth. The malware didn't impersonate a machine. It learned to impersonate legitimacy itself. And as it quietly documented workflows and approval chains, it uncovered the single fact that would turn access into power. This bank didn't physically move money. It issued instructions, trusting that a global system built on certainty would never doubt its voice. By the time the attackers were ready, they didn't feel like outsiders anymore. They felt like part of the system. At the center of this story is a system that almost never makes mistakes because it was never designed to question itself. Global finance does not run on vaults or armored trucks. It runs on messages, and those messages move through an invisible nervous system that links central banks, governments, and financial institutions across the planet. This system exists to eliminate friction, to make certainty faster than doubt, and once an instruction enters it correctly, properly formatted, properly authenticated, properly sourced, it is treated not as a request, but as truth. That design is what allows trillions of dollars to move every day without human hesitation, and it is also what makes the system unforgiving when trust is abused. The attackers understood something most people never consider. The strength of modern banking is not encryption or firewalls, but consistency. Every legitimate transaction looks like every other legitimate transaction. There is no room for intuition, no space for suspicion. because suspicion would paralyze the flow of global money. The system doesn't ask why. It only asks whether the instruction looks right. And once the malware had learned the rhythms of Bangladesh Bank, how approvals flowed, how confirmations were logged, how exceptions were handled, it became clear that no brute force attack was necessary. The system did not need to be broken into. It needed to be spoken to fluently. The attackers saw that while Bangladesh Bank did not keep massive sums of cash within its own walls, it controlled access to something far more valuable: reserve accounts held overseas, guarded by procedures rather than people. Those accounts existed in a world where distance did not matter, where a message sent from one terminal could move hundreds of millions of dollars before anyone could physically react. To the system, the origin of the message mattered more than the intention behind it. And intention by design was invisible. This was the moment when the crime crossed a threshold from infiltration to inevitability. Because once the attackers realized they could issue instructions that would be treated as indistinguishable from legitimate orders, the heist stopped being a question of if. It became a question of timing. The system had been built to trust perfectly. And perfect trust, when turned against itself, leaves no margin for error. The heist did not begin with movement, but with absence, with offices emptying and routines dissolving into habit, because the most important factor that night was not technology, but time. The attackers chose a moment when the world itself was misaligned. Thursday night in Bangladesh, when the weekend had already begun and the bank's halls fell quiet. Friday morning in New York, when the financial system was fully awake and processing requests at speed. And the edge of a long holiday weekend in the Philippines, where banks would soon close and remain unreachable. 3 time zones, 3 calendars, 1 narrow window, where no single human perspective could see the entire picture. As employees logged off and left the building, the attackers logged in not with urgency or haste, but with discipline. This was not a smash and grab. It was a procedure. One instruction at a time, they issued transfer requests through the SWIFT terminal, each one crafted to look identical to thousands of legitimate messages sent before it. There were no massive withdrawals that screamed fraud, no erratic behavior that demanded scrutiny, just repetition, precision, and patience. Inside, the systems that governed global finance, confirmations were generated, approvals were logged, and money began to move. Nearly $1 billion was set into motion, not all at once, but steadily flowing outward through channels designed to reward consistency and punish deviation. And as this happened, the one mechanism meant to translate the digital into the physical. The printer that produced undeniable proof remained silent, deliberately blinded by malware that made its failure look accidental. No one saw the transactions stacking up. No one heard the warning. On the other side of the world, systems at the Federal Reserve processed the instructions exactly as designed, because from their perspective, nothing was wrong. The messages came from a trusted source. The credentials were valid. The formatting was flawless. Money does not hesitate when certainty is absolute. What makes this moment so unsettling is how little drama it contained. There were no frantic keystrokes, no countdown clocks, no visible race against time. The race had already been won by planning. By the time the final instructions were sent and the attackers logged out, erasing traces of their presence as their malware quietly wiped logs behind them, the crime no longer depended on them at all. It was self-sustaining, carried forward by automated systems and institutional trust. When the building slept, the heist continued. When the weekend deepened, the money kept moving. And by the time anyone would notice, the system had already done what it was designed to do: execute orders without emotion, without memory, and without doubt. Discovery did not arrive like an explosion. It crept in through confusion, through small failures that refused to resolve themselves. When employees returned after the weekend, the first sign was inconvenience: a system that wouldn't log in error messages that made no sense, a printer that still hadn't produced anything meaningful. At first it felt technical, mundane, the kind of friction modern offices experience every day. But then came the messages from New York. They were calm, procedural, almost polite, asking for confirmation on a series of payment instructions that, when read together, totaled nearly $1 billion. That was the moment reality snapped into focus. Panic replaced routine. Calls were placed across time zones only to collide with weekends and unanswered lines. Emails were sent faster than they could be read. Faxes and almost obsolete technology were pulled into service in desperation, as if paper itself might slow what software had already finished. Inside the bank, people shut down servers not because they knew what had happened, but because they needed something to stop anything at all. Yet the most unsettling realization came quickly: even total human intervention might not matter. The system had already acted. What followed felt less like investigation and more like waiting for bad news to finish arriving. Then, unexpectedly, fragments of hope appeared, not through skill or foresight, but coincidence. Automated controls at the Federal Reserve flagged dozens of transactions, not because they looked fraudulent, but because a word in the transfer data resembled the name of a sanctioned Iranian shipping vessel. Human reviewers paused, questioned, and froze nearly $870 million in motion. Another transfer bound for Sri Lanka collapsed under the weight of a single misspelled word, one missing letter that triggered suspicion and forced the money to be rerouted back to safety. These were not victories. They were accidents. When the dust settled, the truth was brutal and precise. Out of 35 attempted transfers, only 4 had succeeded, but those 4 were enough. $81 million was gone, not delayed, not pending, gone. In that moment, the bank understood something far worse than loss, that control had been an illusion, and survival had depended not on preparation, but on chance. Once the money cleared the final checkpoint, it entered a place where accountability dissolves by design. It did not vanish into offshore vaults or encrypted wallets, but into environments built to absorb excess without asking questions. Casinos. In 2016, the Philippine gaming industry operated in a regulatory gray zone where large transfers could move quickly and oversight lagged behind scale. The stolen funds arrived quietly split across accounts routed with just enough complexity to blur their origin without drawing attention. From there, they flowed into private gambling rooms, junkets reserved for high rollers, sealed spaces where cameras are distant and discretion is currency. The money was not withdrawn immediately. That would have raised alarms. Instead, it was converted into chips, cycled through games with predictable loss curves, and slowly transformed back into cash, a process designed to make the source of funds indistinguishable from chance. Baccarat tables became laundering machines, absorbing millions through repetition rather than risk. To anyone watching, it looked like wealth behaving normally. A portion of the stolen money, $30 million, was transferred to a single individual, a Chinese national, who would later disappear without a trace, leaving behind no explanation, no recovery, and no body of evidence strong enough to follow. The remaining funds were broken apart, scattered, and moved again, crossing borders, while investigators were still arguing over timelines. By the time authorities traced the trail to casino floors, the money was no longer sitting still long enough to be seized. It had been played, exchanged, repackaged, and released back into the system under a different identity. This was not speed, it was patience. Not concealment, but normalization. The most devastating realization came afterward. Nothing dramatic marked the moment the money was lost forever. No final transaction, no closing door. No, just a quiet understanding that once money is allowed to behave like money for long enough, it stops remembering where it came from. In the aftermath, investigators searched for a single moment where the crime could have been stopped, a single line of code or missed safeguard that might explain how something this large could slip through unseen. What they found instead was more disturbing. The system had worked exactly as intended. The malware left fingerprints that connected this heist to a wider pattern of attacks, a shadow economy where hacking replaced trade and financial theft became policy rather than crime. Estimates suggested that more than $1 billion had been targeted across the globe. Yet the Bangladesh bank heist remained uniquely haunting, not because of how much was stolen, but because of how quietly it happened. In response, protocols were rewritten, oversight tightened, and institutions promised vigilance, but none of those changes addressed the core truth this case exposed. The failure was not technological, it was philosophical. Modern systems are built on trust because trust is efficient and efficiency is profitable. But trust, once automated, stops asking questions. The printer was eventually replaced, the servers rebuilt, the routines restored. Yet the lesson remained unresolved. The most dangerous attacks do not announce themselves. They blend in. They speak the language of legitimacy. And by the time we notice the silence where noise should be, the damage has already been done not just to accounts or balance sheets, but to the belief that control and security are the same thing. This story isn't really about hackers, banks, or even money. It's about how modern life runs on invisible systems. We rarely question systems built for speed, efficiency, and trust until trust becomes the weakness. The Bangladesh bank heist reminds us that the greatest risks don't always come from chaos, but from routines we stop paying attention to. In a world increasingly automated, awareness is no longer optional. It's a form of defense. If this story made you pause, think, or see everyday systems differently, consider supporting the channel. Like the video, share it with someone who should hear it, and subscribe for more investigative stories that explore the hidden mechanics shaping our lives.